there are growing calls for the evidence used in Lucy Letby's conviction to be scrutinised. A BBC Radio 4 podcast has come out this week covering some of the legal and medical experts who are questioning the evidence used by the police and the prosecution, as well as presenting some highly relevant new facts which are not widely known and weren't part of the court case. Now, this is a channel focused on the statistical side of justice, but there are a number of key points in this podcast which build on things we've raised from the numerical angle, so I'd like to walk you through how this podcast complements our conclusions. Before I jump in though, the prosecution do get their say in the podcast, so let's hear from them first. One of the barristers representing the family says that anyone doubting the case should be ashamed of themselves. One of the prosecution's expert witnesses says that the disregard that the so-called experts have had for these families is quite frankly disgraceful. So the prosecution are not happy with these growing calls for scrutiny and would recommend that you stop listening right now. That's it. Hit stop. Stop. I see. Not going to be told when to think by your superiors? Okay, I'll continue. Let's go back to the framework which, in my opinion, should be considered when investigating concerns raised by a medical team. First, you need to decide if it's just a statistical quirk. Events never exactly follow expectations, and you will always get random noise that can fool people into seeing a pattern. We've taken a detailed look into this in my Stats 101 video and concluded that there is no statistically significant deviation from expected in deaths during 2015 and 2016 at the Countess of Chester Hospital. Next, the environmental factors need to be considered. Things like staff numbers and training, equipment, infections. Now, although there was some evidence of understaffing that could be derived statistically, we had to leave that as an unknown factor before. And this is where the File on 4 podcast can give us a lot more insight, which we'll jump into shortly. Lastly, if a spike in mortality is not a statistical quirk or due to environmental causes, then you need to decide if it's natural causes or murder. And the numbers very strongly led us to natural causes given the multiplicity of the neonatal babies involved, which was covered in my Multiplicity Misunderstood video. So, let's hear from the experts quoted in the Radio 4 podcast to see what they think about the environmental factors. Now, it's important to be clear that this is not new evidence. It hasn't been tested in court. We don't know how credible these experts are. But, at face value, what these experts have to say is highly relevant to the case. First up, a neonatology expert who starts by saying, they failed to recognise that baby C had a bowel obstruction that needed urgent surgical opinion and probably surgery to save the baby's life. They continue to say that baby C's size and prematurity put him at the limit of what the Countess of Chester could care for. And that I've got the feeling that the resuscitation was suboptimal. The people's skills were not up to the job of resuscitating a tiny baby like C. Lastly, they said that, I just don't believe this wild hypothesis based on no evidence whatsoever that somebody inflated the stomach enough to kill the baby. So this expert appears in no doubt that the environment was the cause and that the idea that baby C was murdered was preposterous. Clearly in opposition to the jury who found Lucy Letby guilty of murdering baby C. The podcast also includes some new information which I'd not come across before and is very revealing on the environmental side. Note again, this information has not been presented and challenged in court, so we can't yet call it evidence, but it is quite indicative nevertheless. Firstly, a 2016 Royal College of Paediatric and Child Health review of the Countess of Chester Hospital neonatal unit, which concluded that there was insufficient senior cover and a reluctance to seek advice. Consultants only did 2 ward rounds a week and nurses were overstretched. Next, the podcast shared several entries from the Countess of Chester's risk register. Firstly, in March 2015, the ward is understaffed and underskilled. Then a year later, the ward is understaffed and underskilled. There are repeated references to high risk due to a lack of doctor cover. In November 2015, issues with the transport team not being available when they were needed. Same again in March 2016. Then in May 2015, a high risk was noted due to an outbreak of antibiotic-resistant bacteria on the ward. 9 months later, the outbreak of antibiotic-resistant bacteria has not been eradicated. Note that from the podcast it is a bit unclear if that 9 months ran to May 2015 or from May 2015, which is quite crucial given the dates of the spike in mortality. And again, note, this risk register is not in the public domain, so we have to take this evidence with a pinch of salt until it is shared and verified. But it again points towards environmental factors playing a key role in any unexpected jump in neonatal mortality during this period. The podcast also raises challenges and concerns about some of the evidence presented at court. You'll no doubt recall that this spreadsheet was the smoking gun, which came out early in the investigation and directed the whole police case towards proving Lucy Letby was guilty. Now, we call this the bias rota, as it doesn't include all staff or members of the public who were in the hospital, and it doesn't include all events, just those subjectively called suspicious, after a non-anonymous review of medical notes by a medical expert. We also discussed how it was odd to assume that only nurses on shift at the time of a suspicious event were at fault, when the harmful event might occur right at the start of the shift and was more likely due to actions in the previous shift. Well, the podcast does discuss this in quite some detail around baby C. The podcast points out that the medical evidence, an X-ray, used to indicate that deliberate harm had been caused to the baby, was taken the day before that baby died. So the nurses on duty the day baby C died were not responsible. Thus the whole basis of this spreadsheet is called into question, as the wrong nurses are shown for baby C, and presumably for many other babies whose tragic deaths were not caused during the shift in which they died. The podcast does also raise the point that Lucy Letby was not on shift between the time baby C was born and the time the X-ray was taken. Her first contact with baby C was on the shift when he died. So the implication is that the baby was harmed before the baby had even encountered Letby. Now, this is a little speculative, as we're not told where Letby was when not on shift, and whether she could have popped in unnoticed. So I don't think we should be overly quick to exonerate her, but we should be questioning the rota and its confounding of both the true facts and the police investigation. We should also bear in mind that this evidence has already been presented to the jury, but the jury chose to rely more on other pieces of evidence. So this is not revelatory new evidence, just a question on the credibility of the evidence presented. The podcast does have other things to say on the topic of the evidence used against Letby. It covers a letter signed by 280 medical professionals, that's NHS nurses, doctors, consultants and hospital managers. This was delivered to Keir Starmer, Prime Minister of the UK Labour government, in support of Lucy Letby, directly questioning the evidence that has been used in court against her. Secondly, a letter signed by 24 neonatal and statistical experts was also delivered to the government, asking for their concerns around this case to be investigated. A leading expert on the immunoassay test, which relates to whether synthetic insulin is present, said that confirmatory tests are absolutely vital. I wouldn't forward them to the clinician without verifying their veracity and integrity. Remember that Letby was sentenced to life for 2 attempted murders due to injecting babies with insulin. The podcast also discusses just how much insulin would be required to cause the effects claimed, and it's a huge amount that would have been noticed as missing in the unit, whereas no report of missing insulin has been made. And a biomechanical engineer said that there was a degree of certainty presented in the case that is in no way justified by the level of uncertainty that we know about in neonatal physiology. They also very much summed up how many people are feeling by saying that it is completely inappropriate to be that certain. So, what do the legal experts on the podcast say about the evidence? A criminal defence barrister said that you might get 8 pieces of evidence, but if in and of themselves, each one of them is really weak, 8 times 0 is 0. It's not 8. Lucy Letby's new barrister said that there's a strong case that she is innocent, and that other experts have raised concerns about the way medical evidence was interpreted and then presented to the jury. So in conclusion, we have lots of legal and relevant medical experts challenging quite strongly the expert testimony given in the trial of Lucy Letby, and we have lots of new potential evidence around the environmental factors that the staff at the Countess of Chester Hospital were fighting against during this spike in neonatal deaths. So, if these expert opinions become new evidence, that is sufficiently robust to stand up in court, then perhaps there is enough information to say that environmental factors were to blame for the rise in neonatal mortality during this period, and that there really was no murder case for Lucy Letby to be accused of at all. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. And if you'd like to hear more from the BBC, then the full podcast link is in the notes to this video. If you'd like to hear more of a statistical angle on this case, then do check out my Stats 101 and Multiplicity videos. This has been a Justice by Numbers production. Please like, subscribe, comment, recommend, share to support this new channel and the debate it is bringing to the Lucy Letby case. Thank you.